Hello. We conclude our first week by our last item, the break-even analysis. You remember that we first look at how sales are moving through time. Then we analyze the structure of the margins, insisting on two major factors, the so-called scissor effect and the break-even point. What is the break-even point? It is the minimum level of sales that the company should achieve in order to make a profit. Below that level, we make losses. Above that level, we generate profits. This obviously requires that we take a close look to our cost and classify them into fixed cost on the one hand and variable cost on the other end. Variable costs are costs which move, which vary with sales. I produce one bag and I need a certain amount of leather or plastics. I produce two bags, I need twice as much of leather or plastics. Fixed costs are costs which remain the same whatever level of activity, at least within a certain range. We'll come back to that later on. Whatever the level of my sales, I need to pay the same fees for auditing my accounts or for paying my legal advisor. Let's summarize the break-even analysis by the very well-known graph. And you see on this well-known graph that you have the fixed cost, you have the variable cost that you add to that, to have the total cost, and your total revenues. And the crossing point is the break-even, where you go from a situation where your costs are higher than your revenues to a situation where your total revenues are higher than your total cost. This break-even analysis is essential because it is the basis of understanding the so-called operating leverage, which links the change in the level of sales and the change in profitability. Let's take a very simple example. I sell a product for $10 a piece. The unit variable costs are, for example, $7, and my total fixed costs are $1,500. Anytime I sell a product, I generate a margin on variable cost, or what we call sometimes the unit contribution, equal to $10 minus $7, $3. In order to cover the $1,500 of fixed cost, I obviously need to sell 500 units, that is 1,500 divided by 3. In other words, as you can see on the slide, the break-even point in volume is equal to the fixed cost divided by the unit contribution. Calculating the contribution margin, which is the unit selling price minus the unit variable cost, the whole thing divided by the unit selling price, that is, in my example, $10 minus $7 divided by $10, we find 0.30 or 30%. And I found my break-even level of sales in dollars, which is $1,500 divided by 0.30, which turns out to be the $5,000 that we found earlier. Three very important rules need to be remembered. Rule 1. If we consider the example of three companies, Compass, the UK firm in catering, Roche, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant, and Pirelli, the Italian pneumatics group, three companies in very different industries. They all had in 2012 the same sales growth of roughly 7%, but a very different growth in EBIT, from 8% for Compass to 34% for Pirelli. Why such a difference? The answer is, for a big part, linked with a difference in cost structure of the three entities. Compass has a high level of variable cost. When you sell a meal, the essential costs are variable, raw materials. While Pirelli, to produce its tires, needs plants, machinery, equipment, a high level of fixed cost. So rule number 1 is the following. The higher the fixed cost in a company, the higher is the sensitivity of profits to changes in the level of activity. This is the case of Pirelli. And this has little to do with the skills of managers, but basically relies on the cost structure, the mix between fixed and variable cost in the industry. Or to say it differently, the lower the fixed cost, the lower is the volatility of earnings. This is the case of Compass. Let's look now at two companies in the same industry with roughly the same change in the level of activity. France Télécom and Maroc Telecom. Revenues going down by 3 to 4%. The impact on EBIT is quite different. Minus 6% versus minus 11%. This is obviously not a question of mix of fixed costs and variable costs, as we are in the same type of business, but an issue related to the position of the company vis-à-vis its break-even point. And the rule is the following. The closer is a company to its break-even point, the more sensitive it is to changes in the level of activity. Sometimes you'll hear a chief executive officer announcing with a great pride and a big smile that they have been able to grow their profit by 70% while their sales grew by 10%. Great. But often not due to their talent or their skills, but more basically to the position of their firm in terms of break-even point. And if next year their sales go down by 10%, they might very well see their operating profit collapsing by 60 or 70%. Let's look now at a company called Alcatel between 2000 and 2005. The revenues went from more than 30 billion euro to 13 billion euro, a huge and dramatic decrease. We could have predicted a complete collapse in the operating result. And on the contrary, what do you see? Alcatel has seen its EBIT improving from a negative 2.3 billion euro to a positive 1.3 billion euro. Why this nice surprise? Because the fixed costs are not fixed. They are fixed within a certain range, but move by step for major changes in the level of activity. If I produce 100,000 tons of a certain product, I can probably, if I'm not running my operation at full capacity, produce 120,000 tons or even 130,000 tons without impacting my fixed cost. But if the demand is extremely strong and I have to produce now 200,000 tons, I will have probably to extend my capacity and build a new plant, buy new machinery, and therefore increasing suddenly my fixed cost by a very significant amount. What Alcatel was able to do is to dramatically reduce its fixed cost and come to profit despite a huge reduction of sales, a huge reduction in size, a downsizing as we call it sometimes. Reducing the viable fixed cost, if I can call it like that, or transforming fixed cost into viable one is a key features in all restructuring program. So, to conclude, when analyzing the margin of a company, the topics of our first week, never underestimate the mix between variable cost and fixed cost, the position of the firm vis-à-vis its break-even point, and the ability of the organization to transform through higher flexibility, outsourcing for example, fixed cost into variable cost. Operating leverage, like financial leverage, which we will study in week 3, is a major source of volatility of profit. This is now the end of week 1, and I'm going to ask you to do some personal work for the next session by computing, using the information provided in the case, the break-even point of Gremlin in the last 3 years. And we'll go through it together in our live session. Have a good and efficient work, have fun, and see you soon.